Hey, hey, hey! Today we're going to talk about 5,000 Hispanic Confederate soldiers, asterisk. Now, how do we know that there were 5,000? We know because their names and unit designations are recorded in this handy-dandy roster book compiled many years ago by a certain John O'Donnell Rosales and updated several times in different editions since then. Now, why am I saying asterisk with this figure of 5,000 Hispanic Confederate soldiers? Well, I'm saying that because not all of them were actually soldiers in the Confederate Army. 79 of them were in the Confederate Navy or Marine Corps, which is really interesting. That would make Hispanics probably the smallest minority represented in the Confederate Navy, even smaller than African Americans. Very strange statistic, but there's strong evidence supporting that there were just over 1,000 African Americans in the Confederate Navy. So at 79, just 79 guys in the Navy and Marine Corps, this is a very tiny minority, and I'm still not aware of any evidence of Native Americans in the Confederate Navy or Marine Corps, but that is interesting. The other reason that I say asterisk is because apart from the guys who were actually in the armed forces, a lot of the names listed in this book were in the state militia. And even though a lot of state militia units did fight in the war and did see combat, they were not the same organization as the Confederate Army. And also, unlike, the Georgia militia at the Battle of Atlanta, or the Louisiana militia specifically in the Siege of New Orleans in late 1861, early 1862, most state militia units in the Civil War basically drilled and then disbanded when they got bored. So, let's see what this pack of goodies has to show us today. This book that I'm holding right here is the 3rd edition. Now, this book's got an interesting little preface. It's an essay where the author explains his study of 5,000 Hispanic Confederate soldiers, sailors, Marines, and militiamen, and he also gives commentary on why this is important to him. My name is John O'Donnell Rosales. I am a Cuban exile. Ooh. My family history is heavily intertwined with that of Louisiana, Florida, and the Gulf Coast during the colonial period. Okay, so Spanish Louisiana, Spanish Florida. That is some old school heritage because most Hispanics in the United States trace their heritage either to New Spain, which is Mexico, or New Granada, which is parts of South America, except Brazil. Our history in the United States did not begin when fleeing the communist regime of Cuba. We arrived here in 1971. You see, we and others had been here before as explorers, colonists, missionaries, and soldiers in war. The proximity of Cuba and Mexico to the United States, as well as the Spanish settlements in the Gulf Coast, the Southwest, and the Atlantic made commerce, immigration, and intermarriage commonplace. There were whole regiments of Spanish militia stationed in what became the southern states. That's true. Since these were in their majority, single bachelors intermarried with the diverse peoples of the area. When Spain sold Florida to the young United States in 1819, an era came to an end, although Hispanic influence continued first as Spanish, then Mexican in the Southwest and Texas up until the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. Interesting. Links with Spain and her former colonies were not broken off. There was a brisk and steady business between the Spanish colonies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the new Central and South American nations with New Orleans, Mobile, St. Augustine, Charleston, Pensacola, and other southern port cities. The business between the border of the United States and Mexico led an additional number of Hispanics to settle in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. That is very true. This settlement and shipping business led to a strengthening and retention of the Spanish language and culture in the coastal Gulf, Atlantic, and southwestern states. As a matter of fact, ironically, I believe the Hispanic population in the Southwest, including Texas and New Mexico, actually increased after American annexation. Most of those states, when they were still Mexican states, were frontier states, very sparsely populated. The war for Southern independence saw thousands of these men flock to the Confederate cause. I guess you could call it the War for Southern Independence. Whole companies were raised, composed fully or partially of Spanish Hispanic men. The history has been largely forgotten in this era of political correctness. The vogue term for us lately in the American media has been Latinos/Latinas. Well, this is already outdated because nowadays the vogue term for the Hispanic community is Latinx, which, to this day, with a couple of exceptions, the only people I've actually seen use Latinx as an American Hispanic were folks who did not speak Spanish. Hispanics who don't speak Spanish, they only speak English, which is why Latinx makes sense to them linguistically speaking. It works in English, it does not work in Spanish. Whole companies were raised composed fully or partially of Spanish Hispanic men. This history has been largely forgotten in this era of political correctness. Political correctness does have a lot to do with it. There is a lot of pushback from folks who politically or ideologically they might lean to the left, because a lot of folks who lean to the left, they just don't want to hear about Black Americans or other ethnic minorities fighting for the slavery army. And it was a slavery army, sorry. The state secession declarations make their cause abundantly clear. Most of them don't even mention taxes and tariffs. But yeah, a lot of folks on the left just don't like that type of narrative. They can't imagine why people would support oppression or support white supremacy. And the simple answer is, in certain communities, a lot of Hispanics were counted as white. So if Texas or Louisiana society was all that they knew, a lot of them would have bought into slavery. That said, though, I'm willing to bet, just throwing chips on the table, that the majority of the Hispanic soldiers were drafted, because the Southern Army was the first one that had a draft, even before the Northern Army. I personally do not speak Latin, nor was I born in ancient Latium, but I respect those who choose to identify themselves as Latinos or Latinas, as I am sure they have their reasons to do so, just as I have mine against referring to myself as anything but Spanish, Hispanic, or Cuban. Reminds me of that George Lopez joke. My parents are from Mexico, but I'm from Spain. I am Hispanic of Spain by majority ancestry and speak Spanish proudly. I am olive-skinned and proud of the racial and ethnic mixture that runs in my veins, which reflect the genes of the Spanish Canary Islanders, the Basque people of the mountains dividing Spain and France, and the Cuban Taino, Siboney, vestigial Native American blood of my direct lineal ancestors. Well, that's nice that he is very proud of his mixed heritage, as well as I am proud of my mixed heritage, but if he was olive-skinned, there is a good possibility that if he was an actual Southern soldier in 1861, 62, 63, he probably would have been heavily discriminated against, and we know this from the diaries and memoirs of some of the Hispanic Confederate soldiers in the Texas forces. One of them that comes to the top of my head is the memoirs of Santiago Tafoya, and he talks about straight up deserting, because a lot of the white soldiers, when morale was low, they would just start lynching some of the Hispanic soldiers. That was a high cause of desertion among Hispanics in the Confederate Army. There were also other incidents, like when the Sibley Brigade was requisitioning supplies from the residents of the Mesilla Valley, who were mostly Hispanic, and they were just coming through and taking them, just like a lot of the commissary soldiers across the South. And for example, a huge cause of desertion for the Confederate Army during the New Mexico campaign is when the Confederates were just taking stuff from the Mexican population and they were being brutal about it. So a lot of the Spanish-speaking soldiers had a problem with this. They wanted nothing to do with economically or physically hurting Hispanic people of the same religion, the same language, so a lot of the soldiers just deserted. The United States, like many other nations, has a very small minority of people who are racist, segregationist, and bigoted, yet for every racist, segregationist, and bigot, we have thousands of righteous men and women who combat their madness and ignorance. Interesting statement. America is great because of righteous people like these. No other nation will ever be able to have its armies drink from our rivers or streams, for a united America can never be defeated. This lesson was learned by all our enemies and is a lesson racists and segregationists have also learned, for the betterment of our nation and its many diverse peoples. America is great because of its diversity, not in spite of it. Hispanics can be of any race or religion. We run the color spectrum from white, brown, red, yellow, or black to a mixture of these. We have fought in every war the United States has been in, but we seem to have been forgotten and ignored by historians when it comes to the War of Southern Independence. Well, part of that, as I explained earlier, from the pushback from the left-wing side, they don't like exploring ethnic minorities fighting for a cause that was ultimately white supremacist. Folks, I don't care about your great-great-grandfather who was just defending his farm and he didn't own slaves, because his farm and him not owning slaves was not in his state's secession declaration, period. Those were the casus belli right there. And the war started because 7 southern states were saucy that the guy who said slavery can stay where it exists but no new territories, he won the election. And they were mad about that. There's no getting past that, I'm sorry. Another comment is, even though yes, Hispanics do run the color spectrum because the Spanish Empire conquered a very diverse array of territories, including some in the Pacific Islands. However, Hispanics of certain shades, like black, definitely would have been excluded from the Confederate Army until March of 1865. For the overwhelming majority of the war, Hispanics who were black would have been relegated to hard labor or work like being body servants, cooks, drummers, things like that. And that was in the Confederate Army regulations. That was the rules that the Southerners made up. Sorry. I didn't make up those rules, they did. The time has come to speak of these silent men who, like the Black American Confederates, have been almost forgotten. History is the study of facts. Oh yeah, so the other reason for pushback, not from the left but from the right, a lot of modern-day lost causers who are not racist have a very hard time grappling with this, but there were certain decades, there's about a good 60 years, where the majority of people who subscribed to the lost cause were white supremacists. And a lot of the people who fought for the lost cause were white supremacists. They put it on a lot of their monuments. For example, the Battle of Liberty Place, which was fought several years after the Civil War, in the monument that Southerners put up to those ex-Confederates who committed terrorism, they literally said that they redeemed their state for white supremacy. That's what the monument said. So while one of the reasons, yes, why Confederates from ethnic minorities have been written out of the history books is because a lot of left-wingers just don't like dealing with that source information, but also for decades, there was a lot of people who were only focusing on the heroism of white Confederates, and every once in a while, they would invite some honored former body servant to the veterans reunions. But the fact that some of those guys got honored in the 1920s and 1930s does not change the oppression that they lived through in the 1860s. I have heard it said by real racists that we cannot assimilate, that we aren't part of Western civilization and other stupidities. They seem to forget that Spain is in Europe, and even in the most remote village in the Hispanic areas of the Philippines, Equatorial Guinea in Africa, Caribbean, Central and South America, Spanish is the language of education and culture, even if the ethnic group is non-white Hispanic. Very true, but remember there's also a lot of people walking around shouting stuff like, "This is America, you should speak English," when people speak this European language. The purveyors of hate and disunity on all spectrums of the color line are the real enemies of America. I must honestly admit that, although I love the United States, I have never felt American. Instead, I feel Southern and Spanish. Okay. Well, I'm not going to negate that he feels that way, but we're talking about his feelings now. We're no longer talking about facts about Hispanic Confederates. I love the swamps of Florida and Louisiana, the Blue Ridge of Virginia, and the red soil of Alabama. The South will only rise again when white, black, red, yellow, and brown realize that this is our land and that we have to live and work together not only to help the South, but also to help America flourish for countless generations to come. What is it that Texas said in its secession declaration? As a matter of fact, let's look it up real quick. Texas secession ordinance. Ah, yes. She was received as a Commonwealth holding, maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Her institutions and geographical position established the strongest ties between her and other slaveholding states of the Confederacy. Well, that right there clashes totally with this idea of Southerners of all colors banding together so that the South can rise again. That might happen sometime in the future, but it would have to be for completely different causes, because what Confederate states, well, Texas at least was the single Confederate state with the most Hispanic population, period. And the Texas legislature put it plain as day. They put it on paper. Negro servitude to the white race. That's just not a cause that most non-white Southerners are going to be willing to fight for in the 21st century. Period. I'm going to skip ahead here to the end of this section. Our ancestors were brave men and women who were not afraid or ashamed to fight for their proclaimed independence. Well, except for the people who were drafted and who later deserted, but that's an aside. We have no reason to let them look down from heaven and be ashamed of us for not preserving their memories, history, and Confederate symbols. Those symbols must be kept clean from those who, in their absolute ignorance, racism, and segregationist hatred, deem to use them to divide America and for other nefarious purposes and deeds. Alright, so who are we talking about here? Are we talking about the Klan? Are we talking about David Duke's friends? Are we talking about some of the people from the Council of Conservative Citizens who talk about how 3 out of 5 black people have HIV? Or are we talking about the liberals here? Who are we talking about that's ignorant? Is it all of the above? Continuing, their spirits linger here in every valley and in every glen, on every hill and on every mountaintop, in every swamp and in every forest. They linger in places like Gettysburg and in fields known but to them and God. Thus let the battle flags fly. Let them once again catch the wind. It is the least we can do for our valiant dead. Deo Vindice. Signed, John O'Donnell Rosales. There's a lot to unpack there. A lot of this has more to do with his feelings and his pride in his heritage than it does with historical facts. This is where we're going to leave off today because there is so much more to cover in this and so much more to unpack. Because there is so much to unravel here, we're going to need a part 2 for this. However, if you guys want to look ahead into the Hispanic Confederates book, literally most of the book is a roster. It's got the names and the unit designations right here. You can buy the book or you can look for it, but there will be a part 2 in which we discuss more of what's written in this essay. There are several more pages, and as you can see, just in the couple of pages that we read, I had a lot of commentary about it. Thank you for watching the Civil War Wild West edition, and I especially want to thank the people who disagree with me but who stick around anyway. I do appreciate your time.